Hey, we're going to start at 11:30, about 3 minutes from now. I'm just going to sit here and enjoy this beautiful day for a minute and go, what the heck am I going to do with my hair? So, anyway. 2.5 minutes. Going live in a couple minutes at 11:30. Just letting everybody get a chance to sort of assemble in. Didn't do that. I think I looked at it. Beautiful day. I guess that's a problem. Oh my God. 60 seconds. We got 60 seconds. Everybody, you ready? All right, I got 11:30. I guess we can get started. Good morning, everybody. One really quick announcement before we start with the Revelation. We are next week is first Wednesday. It'll be the first Wednesday of the month. Next Wednesday, a week from today, and we're going to do just for the fun of it, trying it and whatever. We're going to do both online and we're going to do a drive-in service. So if you live in the area and you want to come, we're going to try to offer communion as a drive-in. We'll have prepackaged things, and then we'll also have it online. So if you want to bring your own stuff and have it at comfort of your home, you can do that too. And so that's next week at 7 on Wednesday. And so, hey, Harold made it. Yay, Harold. All right, let's get going. We're in Revelation chapter 1. We've been kind of introducing the concept of the book as we slowly meander through chapter 1. And so we're going to finish up chapter 1 today with the meandering and talk a little bit about more. And I should give you a warning. This is like the third time I've taught through the book of Revelation, but I'm a learner. I'm somebody who just keeps digging. So I'm looking forward to working through the book myself again. And fourth time I've taught through the book, and I really am looking forward to what I'm going to learn along the way. So when I'm going into new commentaries and new stuff the whole time we're going to do this, and I hope you're going to be able to do that too, that you're going to be able to read it for yourself and learn and grow while we're going through here. And in chapter 1 is kind of chapter 1 sets the stage for the whole book. It's more of an introduction than it is a lot of content. And today we're in verses 9 through 20, and what's happening is John is sort of introducing the characters. Who are the people? Who are the big players in all this? And he starts out in verse 9, and he's introducing himself. He's telling you about himself, and he says, "I, John, your brother and companion in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that are ours in Jesus was on the island of Patmos because of the Word of God and the testimony of Jesus. And so he's basically saying, I'm somebody who's living in the world you're living in. I'm going through all the crap you're going through with you. So, so understand that. That's kind of what he's, real quick, just giving you that little snippet of a picture of himself. And understand too, as we talk about this, from the evidence that we have, the churches that he's addressing were not suffering severe persecution. Now, there is severe persecution in that general time frame with some of the Roman emperors and stuff, but right now the 7 churches he's writing to, they're probably not getting persecuted as much as they're just living in a hostile world, which is what we're doing. Okay, so anyway, now he's talked about himself. Now he's going to really introduce Jesus to us. And this is where we need to remember this. This is an oral book. This is a book meant to be read aloud. I told you yesterday about how I read basically the entire book at a worship service. Took 45 minutes to do it, and it was incredibly powerful. So what I want you to do is I'm going to read from here through verse 16, verses 10 through 16, the description of Jesus. And I don't want you to microanalyze it. I want you to just hear it. I want it just to impact you, to speak into your life, to give you the impact it should have, because that's how it works most powerfully, is if you let it speak at you, okay? So, verse 10, on the Lord's day, I was in the Spirit, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet, which said, write on a scroll what you see, and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. I turned around to see the voice that was speaking to me. And when I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And among the lampstands was someone like a son of man, dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet, with a golden sash around his chest. The hair on his head was white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze, glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and coming out of his mouth was a sharp double-edged sword. His face was like the sun, shining in all its brilliance. Did you hear that? Did you feel that? Did you? Wow. Okay? Wow. Your primary response to that should be wow. Okay? Now, if you want to, at this point, dig in, that's cool. I mean, there's some cool stuff you can dig in, and let me give you one of them real fast. Daniel 7:9 in the book of Daniel, which is also an apocalyptic section, that same genre of writing, has an interesting text. He's talking, and it says, as I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, the hair of his head was white like wool, his throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. And again, you've got the whole, John just copied that part, right? It said, his head was white as wool, and his clothing was white as snow. Just exactly the same thing. So, just a little side note, anyone who says the early church didn't believe Jesus was divine hasn't been paying attention, because John just took an Old Testament description of God and applied it to Jesus. But the thing I want you to get, the thing you need to get, is just how awesome Jesus is. I want you to hear that. I want you to see that. That's this whole way through. I want you to feel this book. Now, I'm a very logical person. I'm not the biggest feeler in the world, but this book is a book to be felt, to be experienced. Not, as I'm going to say over and over, not to be micro-analyzed. Like I said, there's value in some analysis, and as you dig into things here, you'll find, whoa, that's a cool reference to the culture, and that's a really cool reference to the Old Testament, and that's a cool reference to something else. And they're very cool things in there, and they're very neat. But you have to start at the big picture. Because if you start with the minuscule stuff, all you end up with, like we've been saying all along, is a chart instead of a movie. A chart with all the characters and all the people and what happens to everybody. You'll end up with that, but you won't have a movie. You won't have the experience, and it's important you get the movie. Okay? Now, the second question that you see is, you've got Jesus, and all this stuff is happening. And it says next is where he is. Okay? Because he's in amidst these 7 lampstands. He's walking around among the lampstands, and he's holding 7 stars. Those are interesting. He's going to tell us what those mean in just a minute. But it's important that we just recognize, here's Jesus in all his power as the divine Son of God, walking around among 7 lampstands holding 7 stars. And then John responds to seeing Jesus in his glory, and he responds properly. Verse 17 says, "When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Then he placed his right hand on me and said, 'Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades. Write therefore what you have seen, what is now, and what will take place later. The mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand and of the 7 golden lampstands is this.'" Let me explain those lampstands and let me explain those stars. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. And first, again, before we dig into what does that mean, what does that impact? How does that hammer at us? How does that speak to us? And the thing is, if I'm a member of the church in Laodicea, if I'm a member of the church in Sardis, one of the ones who were the original recipients of this letter and this revelation, how does it make me feel to know that, oh, wait a second, my church is one of the lampstands, and the angel of my church, whatever that means, is also us, and Jesus is among us, and Jesus is holding us? How does that make you feel? To know that Jesus is among us, and Jesus is holding us, especially when you combine it with just how powerful Jesus is. That's pretty cool. It is really cool to know that this Jesus who is God has me in his hands, has our church in his hand, and is among us. I love those 2 symbols, among us and holding us. That's sweet. Now, when he says angels, what's he mean that? The angel of the 7 churches. And people go around on it, but because the word angel means messenger, and some people think that maybe that the angel, trying not to sneeze right now, that the angel could just be the pastor or the leader of the church, but that's just not how that word is used in the New Testament, especially not here. It's always a powerful being. And so I think it's too big for the pastor of the church. I don't think that's got it, or one of the elders, whatever. Some people go with guardian angel. That's possible. That's the guardian. Each church has a guardian angel. That could well be what it says here. But I like the symbolic answer better here. Sometimes I like the symbolic, sometimes I like the literal better. Here I like the symbolic, that it is a divine, not the divine, it is the representation of the church in its power and authority, that this angel represents the church. It kind of is the church, but we tend to think of the church as this gathering of X people, and we don't see, this is going to sound all new agey, I don't mean it that way, but we picture a church, and okay, let me go back to the Old Testament real fast. There's a time when Elisha is in a city. The city gets surrounded by bad guys, and Elisha's servant is all freaking out and scared. And Elisha prays for God to open his eyes, and suddenly the servant sees all the angels, all the divine power that is around, and how much bigger the divine power is than the human power in this situation. And it's almost like I see a church and I see all these individuals. God sees a church and he sees the individuals and the divine aura of power that they come as being. You know, Jesus said, you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you'll have my power and you'll have my authority. And so this is, I think that the angel of the church is, I'm taking it beyond, and it could well be a guardian angel and this piece. It's both the physical and the supernatural presence of this church. I like that image. I don't know if I'm right, but I like it. I like that picture that for Spout Springs Church, there's the people that gather on Sunday morning, but or online, and there is the aura of power that we have, the authority that we have on earth, even as we'll have it in heaven. And so I like that one, and that's how I'm going to interpret it. And you can do whatever you want. It's not really that crucial, because over the next 7 sessions, we're going to go into chapters 2 and 3, and we will see each of those 7 churches. John writes a letter to each of those. Jesus writes the letter through John to each of the 7 churches, and we're going to have a lot of fun digging into each of those churches, because the stuff in there is spectacular. It's just great. And each one starts off to the angel of the church. And I'm going to view it as that, but if you want to call it just the pastor, you're going to call it the guardian angel who's passing, whatever you want to do. I'm going that way, okay? Because I'm doing the video, I'm the one talking. So anyway, now we need to stop for a second and cover something before we get into chapters 2 and 3 and the rest of the book, is how do you interpret this book? What should be your guiding outline for interpreting the book? And just, I'm going to give you some little historical stuff, hope you like it. If you don't, well, you know, you're the one who showed up. You can do whatever. But anyway, there are 4 primary ways people view the book. And then there are 4 primary ways people interpret the book, if that makes any sense. Large B. And let's start. Let me give you the 4 theories of how to interpret the book. And a lot of you may not know this. You may have studied the book a lot of times and never heard these pieces. But this is important because the 4 primary ways throughout church history people have interpreted the book. One is what I would call the human history view. And that is that the book of Revelation gives us a specific outline of human history from the time of writing to the final judgment. And what people have done sometimes is they've said, okay, if you go to the 7 churches, the first church represents the church during the time of John, and right this early, and then the second church in the 7 represents the next phase of history, and then the next phase of history, and the next phase of history. So, you know, just to throw out an example, the 5th church might represent the church in the 1500s. You know, things like that. Some people have said it's kind of like that. That is the church moving forward. That's why people, when they get to the 7th one, talk about the lukewarm and all the churches So anyway, that's that one. There are some people who look at the book of Revelation and see it as a very good description of what was going on to the church and in culture at that time. And they think that the book of Revelation is a picture of the first century world. You know, that, you know, the beasts are not popes, are Caesars, emperors of Rome, and they see very clear pictures of what's going on there. The third view is a future-only view. It's the opposite of that one. It says that there's nothing in here that relates to the first century. It's all about end times. This whole book has been sealed up, and until the end times, it won't even really make that much sense, because it's all about end times. There's nothing about current. And then there's an idealistic view, and the idealistic view says that this book has no real literal reality. None of it's literal. It's all about the forces that are working. And so there are always antichrists. And there are always, this battle between good and evil is a constant that runs throughout. It's ran through 2,000 years, and it'll run on into the future. Now, every one of those views has serious problems if you take it by itself. Okay? The human history view takes a lot of work to try to match it up with your version of human history. Because it just doesn't, it's like, you know, it's too much of you squeezing it into what actually happened. The then-only view, it was only about the first century, means why should we read it? What's the point? But the future-only view means the first century people had no reason to read it. If it only applied to now, or actually the future, when Jesus comes back, why did he give it to them? What do they care? It's 2,000 at least years in the future. And the idealistic view, well, the book seems to talk like this stuff's real. It seems to act like there's a reality to this. So here's how I view it. I'm a big all of the above person. I think all of it is, I think there is, idealistically, there is an ongoing battle between good and evil. I think that ongoing battle continues throughout history. If you look in, is it First John? I think it's 1 John. I could have it. Yeah, I'll say 1 John. 1 John talks about antichrists. And Revelation talks about the Antichrist. And my belief is that there are always antichrists. There are always people who are living antichrist, who are living opposed to the gospel of Jesus Christ and are trying to tear it down. And some of them gain power and ascendancy. And it's been going on like that from the beginning, from some of the earliest emperors in Rome to today. And one of these times, okay, that's the idealistic part, but in the future history part, one of these times, that small a Antichrist, one of them is going to rise up and be the capital A Antichrist, and all things are going to come to happen. And I think it was going on in the first century. So here's what was happening then, and here's how it looked, which is kind of a cool thing to know, is in the first century, it looked like this. All this ongoing battle. So I kind of put them all together and say there's this ongoing battle. It was happening in the first century, so you see it very well reflected in church history there. But that ongoing battle goes throughout history, and then at some time in the future, there will be this climax. Now, I've got just enough time to cover the one more thing about interpreting the book that, honestly, most people that I know of spend most of their time on this part. These 4 primary ways of interpreting the book of Revelation. And let me describe them to you, and then we'll talk about them for just a minute. And we'll talk about our approach as we go through the book ourselves, okay? I should start with the one you guys know the best. Because chances are, if you've been around for very long at all, of the 4 views, they primarily focus on chapter 20 and the millennium, the 1,000-year reign of Christ. And the biggest one, the one that 30 years ago, it was easily the most popular. It has been declining in popularity but slowly, but it's declining in popularity ever since. And that's dispensational premillennialism. That's the idea that there's the 1,000-year reign of Christ. There's a literal 7 years that happens before that, and at the beginning of that 7 years, there is the rapture that occurs right here. Then there's 7 years. Then there's 1,000 years. Then there's heaven. And that one, it was. This is going to freak some of you out. I don't hate you. I love doing this stuff. That view was created. If you like it, you say discovered by a guy named John Nelson Derby around 1830. So this view is easily the youngest of the views. It's only not even 200 years old yet in a church that's 2,000. But that one got some really cool novels written about it. And so a lot of people really like that view, and that's one of the 4 views. The next one is just general premillennialism, and that is the idea that there's the 1,000-year reign. It's basically literal, and there's a tribulation right before it, and the church gets taken out, usually in regular premillennialism, right after the tribulation. Okay, that's what the premillennial view is, and it is probably the oldest of the views. It's kind of the opposite of the other one. It's easy to find with people like Justin Martyr and Irenaeus, and possibly all the way back to 130. Okay, so it's early. A third one that had a brief reign of popularity about 100 years ago, a little bit more than that, was called postmillennialism, and that one is that Jesus comes back at the end of the 1,000 years. That there's not a rapture. And the real concept, the 1,000 years aren't really literal. What happens is the church continues to influence the world, and the world gets better and better and better under the influence of the church. And then finally, after the church gets things really, really good, Jesus shows up. That was associated with World War I. Killed that one. Sociologically, prior to World War I, there was this insane optimism, and there was just every day in every way the world is getting better and better. It was tied to the philosopher Hegel, who's not Christian, and it was just this: we are continually improving. And World War I came along, and World War I sucked like nothing had ever sucked before, at least in all these people's memories. And postmillennialism almost died then. There's still a few people out there, but they're very rare. And then the fourth view is called amillennialism, and that's the idea that the millennium is, I have trouble explaining this one, although I kind of find it interesting, but the millennium is kind of instituted by God at the beginning of the church age, and the millennium, we are living the millennium as God's reign begins to espouse itself throughout history. And those are the 4 views. And now you're going to ask me, okay, of those 4 views, Steve, which one do you believe and which are you going to teach as you go through this book? And the answer is none of them. Okay? Because, a couple reasons. For one, that's a conclusion to your study. It shouldn't, that's not, they're talked as strategies, they're actually conclusions. And I want us to say, why don't we just read it? Why don't we just read it and see what we hear it saying back to us? One of the things that you'll find as you look around is each of those 4 views, the people that believe it passionately. And I read a guy named Morris, Leon Morris. I believe he's the one who said, every view of the end times, every one of those 4 views, sounds like it's perfect until you actually study any of the other views. Now, I know most of you have only studied one view, probably. That's a circumstance of when you grew up and where you grew up and the church you first were associated with, and you've only really you've heard there's the right view and there's these 3 wrong ones, if you've heard of the other 3. But the reality is some really great, really smart, really wonderful Christians have and continue to hold every one of those views to this day. And they kind of go like this throughout church history. And I want us to read the book and let the book speak. And at the end of our study, if you think that one of those is important, I personally am a pan-millennialist. Not a pre or a post or an I'm a pan-millennialist. I believe it's all going to pan out in the end and be exactly what God wants it to be. And so I don't stress about which of those 4 I think is the best, because I think there's so much we don't know that it's really hard to get it. So I don't teach one of the 4. I say, let's just read the book and let the book speak. Let it speak into our hearts. Let it be the revelation of Jesus Christ to us. Let us come away with a greater appreciation of Jesus Christ. And if we never, ever again take this majestic, amazing, powerful book and try to distill it down to a stupid chart, I'll be perfectly okay with that, as long as I get a good picture of Jesus and his power moving in history. Is that okay with you guys? I hope so. And we'll see you tomorrow in chapter 2, verse 1, and we'll start with the first of the 7 churches in Revelation, and there's some great stuff coming. Great stuff. So, see you tomorrow.